It is now 2 o'clock, and I'll now turn it over to our training specialist, Caleb Berkemeyer.
Thanks, Maynard. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar about inclusive emergency preparedness for people with disabilities. My name is Caleb Berkemeyer. I am the training specialist for the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. The center is a grant-funded project housed and operated by Transcend, Inc. For this session today, we will have a Q&A period. So as you are listening to the presentation, go ahead and type questions into the chat box. It's best if you put those into the chat box as soon as they occur to you, because we will be collecting them throughout the session, and we'll be able to read those at the end. So as soon as you have a question, just go ahead and type it into the chat box. And please keep your questions to a sentence if possible, 2 at the most. If questions or comments get too long, we just simply can't read them. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our presenters for today, and then I'll turn it over to them. So first, we have Eli Fresquez. He's an attorney at the New York City Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. Formerly, Eli worked as a senior planner and ADA coordinator for NYC Emergency Management. While at Emergency Management, Eli incorporated citywide strategic initiatives and policies to address disability issues. After graduating from law school, Eli began his career in public service at the NYC Department of Homeless Services, where he worked in shelters across the city, and later as an agency hearing representative. Eli also worked for the enforcement unit of the New York State Division of Human Rights, where he investigated and litigated high-impact cases of discrimination on behalf of the state of New York. Eli's co-presenter is Matthew Pavogel. He currently works for NYC Emergency Management as a Community Engagement Outreach Coordinator. In this role, Matthew educates people with disabilities and others with access and functional needs about the additional steps one should take to be prepared for the unexpected. Matthew began his career in public service at the NYC Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. In this role, Matthew spearheaded transportation initiatives, including an accessible parking awareness campaign, Accessible Transportation Expo, and Winter Weather Conference. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand the webinar over to Eli and Matthew.
Great. Thank you for having us today. We'd like to really thank the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center for having us. Also, New York City Emergency Management and the team over there that work on disability and access and functional needs. And also to our FEMA Region 2 partners that covers New Jersey, New York, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Thank you, Jim Fleming and Kathleen Madigan from FEMA Region 2. Real quick, you can see here iconic skyline of New York City, and just to note that we will be focusing on planning and preparedness for organizations and individuals with a particular focus on some coastal storm mass care in an urban setting, but we really hope that a lot of the information we provide today can be useful for all jurisdictions, including those that are more rural. So we also want to note that a lot of the information we're providing today is going to be pretty general and basic, and so for people who are more seasoned in inclusive emergency management, some of this will be repetitive. But since the 2017 and 2018 hurricane seasons and the recent fires and volcanoes, we've gotten a lot of questions and concerns at a real basic level of how can we plan inclusively. So we really wanted to take a step back and go over some basics and then delve into some particulars that deal with individual preparedness and community preparedness. So with that said, I just want to quickly note that the New York City Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities has been operating since 1973 and is the liaison between New York City government and the disability community. So I wanted to pass it over to my colleague, Matthew Pavogel, to talk a little bit about emergency management, and then we'll begin.
Hi, so as Eli mentioned, my name is Matthew Pavogel, and I work for New York City Emergency Management. So New York City Emergency Management, we coordinate, we provide outreach, and we disseminate information to the public. So we work with many different agencies throughout New York City when there is an actual emergency, specifically activations throughout the city. So it could be winter weather to hurricane to a fire. So we work with many different nonprofits and city organizations. And also providing outreach to the public, such as community preparedness, individual preparedness, and preparedness as a whole, and then disseminating information to the public when we're going to open shelters and also service centers when there is an emergency. We currently have about 240 staff members that work in emergency management, and we are in the community. We have people who provide outreach. We have CICs, who are individuals in the community that respond to emergencies, and many other members that work at the agency.
All right, thank you, Matt. So for the agenda today is we're going to go over Emergency Management 101, talk briefly about disability rights, very briefly cover functional planning principles of evacuation, transportation, communication, and sheltering. Then we're going to delve into personal and community preparedness that both Matt and I will speak a bit on. And then we'll hopefully have some extra time to talk about resources. There's a lot of information that's out there really at your fingertips, and we wanted to highlight some that we find very useful here in New York City. All right, so one of the first things we wanted to cover was really having an all-hazard approach. Oftentimes, when we're planning for emergencies, we plan for based on the last incident. So it's important to consider the multitude of potential risks. Here in New York City, obviously we have terrorism and coastal storms, but we're also at risk for building collapses, fires, disease outbreak, extreme heat, flooding. So we really want to take those all into account. Also, we want to note that there is really a growing impact of disasters. Recent studies have shown that the numbers of people impacted is increasing as the baby boomer population gets older. There's additional access issues, and there's been a recent CDC estimate that in 2017, nearly 12 million people with disabilities were impacted by disasters. I also wanted to mention something called the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, which was recently updated in 2017 and provides a common nationwide approach to enable the whole community to work together to manage all threats and hazards. The reasons I wanted to mention this was that I think it's important for people in the disability community, in particular organizations, to at least familiarize themselves with the NIMS system. And it's very easy to do. There's online courses you can take, ICS 100 at FEMA.gov National-Incident Management System. And I think it's a really useful tool for people in the disability community to sort of understand the lingo of first responders and emergency managers. And if people in the disability community and organizations find themselves in an emergency operations center, knowing a little bit about the NIMS system is very helpful. Okay, now we're going to move on to our next slide, slide 14. And this is Emergency Management 101. We wanted to talk a little bit about some key definitions. Access and functional needs is a term that's often used in inclusive emergency management, and it's really about members in the community who may have additional needs before, during, and after an incident in functional areas, including but not limited to communication, medical, maintaining independence, supervision, and transportation. Now, access and functional needs is a bit broader than how disabilities are defined under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Oftentimes, access and functional needs includes people with limited English proficiency. It could also have people who have less access to public transportation or low income. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the cases that have come up in emergency management that deal with disability. The first one is the Supreme Court case that deals with a correctional institution, and the Supreme Court really came down and said that the Americans with Disabilities Act does apply to programs and services by the government. And really the takeaway here is that during a disaster, the Americans with Disabilities Act will apply And so will other protections for people with disabilities, like the Rehabilitation Act or the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. The other important case was CALIF versus City of Los Angeles. And this was the first case that applied emergency management and the ADA, and the settlement was reached with the City of Los Angeles. Also, I wanted to mention BCID v. Bloomberg, and that's a case that applied to New York City, and it was the initial filing was sent in 2012 with a decision in 2013. And part of the BCID case, there was 7 MOUs, and we'll briefly discuss some of them. Now, if people are interested in knowing more about disability and some of the legal cases that have come up, I would suggest people look at Barry Taylor's legal brief, which was funded by the ADA Pacific Center as part of the ADA National Network's efforts to include inclusive emergency management, which can be found at adapresentations.org. All right. Moving on to slide 15. I just wanted to include this slide. It really kind of covers some of the basics about Emergency Planning 101. Be sure to engage leadership, elected officials, leaders in the disability community. Be sure to plan and review. Plans are never completed. They're always ongoing. Consider roles and responsibilities. Define who does what in disability positions. Consider resources, right? Very important to consider what kind of resources are out there and to make sure that you have agreements in place, documents and codifying efforts. We found actually that it's really important to make sure that you have agreements that have disability language or boilerplate language in emergency management. For example, if you are have an agreement with a local vendor to provide durable medical equipment, be sure that you have disability language in there. Same thing when you're dealing with digital media. You want to make sure that you have website accessibility, boilerplate language in there as well. The most important thing about this slide really, though, is making sure that we're eliminating the attitudinal barriers. Oftentimes people in the emergency management community are not people with disabilities. So they plan for the world they see, and that's why it's really important to, when you're looking at your planning efforts, to really try to see outside your own box and engage the community, engage the disability community, and also try to support people and encourage people to be a part of the emergency management community. All right, some functional planning principles. These are nothing new. Many different webinars have had these planning principles and have gone over them, but we thought it's important just to cover our bases here and talk a little bit about them. The first one is self-determination, and that's really about looking at people within the disability community in their own particular needs. So for example, our commissioner, Commissioner Khaleesi, he's a wheelchair user. He's a former Paralympian. You're going to plan for our commissioner differently than, say, an older adult who may have additional mobility issues. So it's really about looking at each person case by case. And that leads us to our second functional principle. And that's really about not generalizing or stereotyping. Oftentimes, it's easy to sort of put people in the disability community into a broad brush, to stereotype. So sometimes we've seen this in the development of voluntary registries. What we really want people to consider are the individual functional needs of people with disabilities. Equal opportunities to benefits. So I think one way of looking at this one is thinking about transportation. Oftentimes we say, well, there's a general transportation program, but does it provide transportation for people with disabilities? What about people who use wheelchairs? Are they able to access transportation? That's what equal opportunity is. Inclusion. This is, again, really important. Often in the disability community, they say nothing about us without us. And this is about making sure that we engage the disability community in our planning efforts. One example, though, is including people with disabilities in our exercises or tabletops that we do. Integration. A good example of this is looking at our emergency shelter system and making sure that we don't have separate emergency shelters for people with disabilities and people who are able-bodied. We really encourage all sheltering to be accessible for everyone. Physical access. This really goes without saying. We should make sure that at the very least ingress and egress out of facilities are accessible, that restrooms are accessible as well. Equal access. We often see this in the registration process. We want to make sure that people are able to register for, say, services at a recovery center or services in order to get disaster assistance, and make sure that there's no barriers in the registration process. Effective communication. This is making sure that we have things in alternate format, such as Braille or ASL interpreters available. And modifications. This one's pretty easy. I think most people understand what reasonable modifications are. One classic example that's often given is in no pets policy and allowing for service animals to be included as a reasonable modification. No charge, really basic, right? We're not going to be charging for any reasonable modifications or any other kinds of our obligations of equal opportunity. All right, slide 17. And this one goes into our functional planning principles. I'm going to hit these pretty quick. Really, one of the basic things, and this is pretty simple, is making sure that we allot time for different kinds of institutions. So here in New York City, when we consider evacuations, we make sure that critical facilities and healthcare facilities are evacuated first. So be sure to allocate time and look at your process of doing so. Also, effective public messaging is very important when it comes to evacuating. We want to make sure that people understand what disruptions there may be to paratransit emergency operations, making sure that paratransit's looped in so that when there is an emergency that everyone understands what the changes may be. Considering appropriate places of intake and requests, this is really about making sure that when people make requests that they go to one particular spot or that there aren't gaps in services and we miss out on people making these kinds of requests. Here in New York City, we use a 311 system for sort of non-emergency assistance. For emergency assistance, obviously, we use 911. I just also wanted to highlight a couple things about evacuations, and I think Matt will speak a little bit more about it as well. But if you're looking at evacuations, say from a facility, say you're an independent living center, we find it really helpful to really engage local fire department, have them come in, do an assessment of the building, get their ideas on how best to evacuate. We actually have 2 new videos that emergency management has recently developed that I think highlight some of the preparedness and evacuation tips. They are called Prepared for the Worst and Caught Off Guard. And you can access those on the New York City Emergency Management YouTube channel called Ready New York, What's Your Plan? All right, slide 18. And again, this is pretty basic. Understand paratransit operations for accessible transportation. Really know the number and type and the protocols in place of paratransit beforehand. Get an inventory. Really find out what is the whole scope and breadth of the paratransit system that you have. Here in New York City, we went through a whole process of inventorying all the different paratransit and other kinds of transportation options that are available to individuals. Also make sure to consider particular medical conditions or what level of homebound evacuation assistance may be needed for people to get transport. So for example, people who are bedridden may need a particular kind of transport as opposed to people who may use a wheelchair or people who may be able to get down the stairs but may need additional assistance once they get out of their building or home onto the street. All right, slide 19, accessible communication. And here we have an image of a person using an electronic tablet. Really, this is about multifaceted use of platforms and making sure that you get as much information out in as many different ways as possible. Here in New York City, for example, press conferences obviously have ASL interpreters, but we wanted to make sure that we codified that, so we developed an interpreter checklist. Also, website accessibility. There's lots of resources available on making sure that your website's accessible. CART, or Communication Access and Real-Time Translation, is also very useful, which can be used in events if you're ever having a town hall, for example. We also want to make sure that you consider simplification of language, making sure that the terms that are being used for the public aren't overly complicated. We also have Notify NYC, which Matt will talk a little bit more about, that is now available in American Sign Language. Of course, we have captioning that's available, particularly on the mayor's YouTube channel. I also wanted to point out that on Android, if you're sending out Twitter, you can add image descriptions pretty easily. If you get that into your workflow, it's not very difficult. If you just go to the Twitter accessibility application on the Twitter iOS platform, I would say it's about in 6 clicks you can actually make sure that your images, have image descriptions. Facebook is a little more challenging to add image descriptions, but at this point, we found Twitter to be very, very easy. All right, accessible sheltering. This is slide 20, and here we have an image of the accessible checklist, DOJ guidelines. It's an image of a shelter. Here we suggest creating a matrix, and we've worked a lot on our emergency sheltering accessibility projects here in New York City. New York City has over 400 emergency shelters, approximately 60 evacuation centers that are now accessible. And this matrix is really to know what you have, what needs to be fixed, what kind of ingress or egress issues may you have if there's no accessible ramp, making sure that the restrooms are accessible. You keep this information up to date as well. Here in New York City, we have what's called the Hurricane Zone Finder. You can just Google that, and you can type in your address, and you can find out your nearest evacuation center. I also will pinpoint the accessible evacuation center nearby as well. Now, just as important as physical access in the shelter, we want to make sure that people are trained. And here in New York City, we've developed a training program to make sure that we have disability coordinators, or what we call disability and access and functional needs coordinators, posted in our evacuation centers. And they have a communication protocol, logistics supply chain for them to work out and make sure that the shelter itself is accessible. Slide 21. So I just wanted to provide a couple of images of some of the supplies that we have in shelters. And these amenities include canes, walkers, wheelchairs, chargers, and more. And these are just a small list of some of the things that we provide in our emergency evacuation shelters. And of course, none of this really matters if you don't have trained coordinators. And that's why we've been working with our Human Resource Administration, also American Red Cross, and our CERT teams to make sure that they're trained in accessibility as well. All right, so we're going to move on, and we're going to talk a little bit about personal preparedness, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Matt Vogel. This is slide 22.
Okay, hello everyone. So I'm going to talk about personal preparedness for people with disabilities. So this slide goes through, there's 3 key steps to having a plan for individuals with disabilities. So this talks about making a plan, gathering supplies, and being informed. In New York City, when we present to the public, we provide presentations. The program is called the Ready New York. It's our main campaign for preparedness for the community, for New Yorkers, but especially for people with disabilities. So we present to many different populations, And we also include people with disabilities. It's really important because people with disabilities are going to have to take additional steps to be prepared when there is an actual emergency. So we go through this plan with all groups that we speak to. I myself have done presentations to organizations that represent people who are blind and low vision, people with developmental disabilities, people who are deaf and hard of hearing, and also people with mobility disabilities. So it kind of runs the gamut. We do presentations to all different types of groups, and these 3 key steps are really important for people with disabilities. So making your plan, specifically actually developing a support network, people that you can reach out to pertaining to your disability. As Eli mentioned before, self-determination. Certain individuals with disabilities are going to need more help than others. So again, the individual is going to be taking responsibility, thinking about what they need help with in time of an emergency. So if someone is blind or low vision and requires additional assistance, that's going to be part of their plan. And same for people who are in a wheelchair, their plan is going to, obviously be a little bit different too. So some of the steps that we provide within the support network when we speak to groups is support network specifically. It can be loved ones, it can be relatives, friends, it could be someone's home attendant. It's basically the individuals you think are going to be able to help you during an emergency. So we've also found, and this is a statistic that I actually have seen, that 70% of the time it's going to be an individual support network that's going to be there before first responders. As you know, we're not saying first responders are not going to help. They're going to, but in case if they're not able to come, if it's a large-scale emergency, first responders, again, it's going to be the support network that will be able to help because individuals are planning this out in advance. Other things we recommend is to sit down with those who are in your support network and to write out where and how and when you're going to evacuate if you have a disability, taking into consideration what steps are going to be needed for your disability specifically. And also knowing medications, like writing down medications, the dosages, how often you take medication, having it all written out in a plan. Many people in general will forget information, and we tell people in the public, people with disabilities too, that you should write information out specifically. We have the campaign, the Ready New York campaign, where we supply brochures to the community, and there is an actual workbook that we provide that you can write information. So that's specific to New York City, but it is transferable to many cities and states. The main types of information I'm talking about, it's very similar. Obviously, our booklets are going to have the contacts information for New York City, but again, it's transferable to where you are located, your jurisdiction. So in addition to having the evacuation medications, it's also important we tell people to provide a copy of keys. That's why, again, the support network are going to be people you can trust. If someone has a disability and they cannot communicate, it's a backup plan that one can have, providing a copy of keys. And that's why it needs to be someone you can trust. And someone that is going to be level-headed, be able to handle an emergency when it does happen. So those are some other tips that we usually provide. Again, contacts are going to be really important, like we mentioned. Someone that is in your area, and then also someone that might be in another city or state. That's specific for New York City. During Hurricane Sandy and also 9/11, September 11th, there was no communication, so having an out-of-state contact is really important. It can relay the information of your disability and what your needs are to your loved ones, relatives, and friends. So that is the main reason why you'd have those contacts out of state, but also locally too. So for making a plan also, evacuation is really important. We touched upon hurricane evacuation centers, and that's one means of if one would need to evacuate. We always tell the community, people with disabilities, try your support network first. That's really key. It's really important. But for some reason, if individuals are in a flood zone or for any other emergency they cannot help, your backup plan has to be Plan B. So for hurricanes specifically in New York City, we have evacuation centers like Eli mentioned. We have 60 of them that are accessible currently, and we have a tool called the Hurricane Evacuation Zone Finder. And that can be located on our website, nyc.gov/emergency management. And in the city, people can call 311 And basically, like Eli mentioned, you can put in your address, and it will tell you what hurricane evacuation zone you live in. For New York City, there's 6 zones. For those affected in zones 1 or 2, those are the lower lying areas. Those are closer to water. So if one was in those locations, they can actually find it out before an actual hurricane or storm by going to the Hurricane Evacuation Zone Finder. And also, again, that tool provides the general evacuation centers and also the accessible ones too. So it lists there the accommodations that we do provide in those centers. So those are things that we have for evacuating. For fires too, we always recommend 911 if you have to evacuate. But again, you're going to take into account what your disability is. So people who communicate differently, if they're using American Sign Language, or if they have a developmental disability, you need to think out your plan beforehand and know how you're going to evacuate. For people who have service animals, I actually have a guide dog myself. We also tell people with disabilities, service animals, to practice evacuation routes because, again, it may take us a little bit longer, but also for people who have guide dogs, myself, I usually explain to people that if my dog travels to a location only on one occasion, he's not going to know where to travel. So it's important to practice the evacuation routes, know specifically where you're going to go. And that can go for also a person in a wheelchair, people with developmental disabilities. You want to know where you're going to be evacuating so it's not overwhelming when an actual emergency hits the city or where your jurisdiction is. So that's for evacuating, and with evacuation, transportation goes hand in hand with that also. For New York City, we have, again, like I mentioned before, the Ready New York program has the My Emergency Plan booklet. It's a workbook where you can write out your transportation needs. So however you travel, that's going to be your Plan A, but Plan B would be another accessible type of transportation. For New York City, we have paratransit, Access-a-Ride, or accessible taxis. Those would be other backups. And or also maybe friends, relatives, maybe they can provide transportation. Maybe they have an accessible vehicle that can help. So those are backups for transportation. In New York City, we have a program called the Homebound Evacuation Operation. We use this as a last resort for those in coastal storm locations. And we use 311 where they can dispatch Access-a-Ride, fire department, or EMS depending on the individual's needs and disabilities. So that's for transportation. And these things are a part of the plan. There are other things that you can include depending on your disability. We tell people with disabilities, whatever your disability is, it's going to be personalized. You're going to know what your needs are to plan ahead of an emergency. The second topic in this slide talks about gathering supplies. So in New York City, we always talk about, during our presentations, a go bag and also an emergency supply kit. So a go bag is for when you need to evacuate if there's a fire, if there's a hurricane, flooding, any type of emergency, maybe even a building collapse, where you want to evacuate as quickly as possible. You'd have the go bag near a door, maybe your front door, or near your bed, where you can pick up the supplies as quickly as possible. So when we do our presentations, we talk about general supplies such as bottled water, having copies of identification cards, having cash and small bills if there's no power, if there's a power outage, also having flashlights, having all those different types of general items, toiletries, a portable phone charger. But if you have a disability, you're going to include additional items. The go bag is personalized to each individual. If there's a household of 4 individuals, each person's going to have a go bag specific to what their needs are. So if you have children, they're going to have certain items. They may have, things to pass the time, like a game or maybe a book. But for people with disabilities, we're going to have items specific to our needs. So for myself, I have a vision disability. I would have an extra cane. I would have an extra pair of sunglasses in my bag. Maybe even have my identifications and information on a thumb drive. So I'd have that considered in my bag. And also I'd have supplies for my service animals since I have a guide dog. So specific items like food and water, maybe a blanket for my service animal, identification card, vaccination records. Those things are going to be included for service animals and also for pets too. For additional items, if someone is using hearing aids, we recommend having extra batteries for hearing aids, or maybe if you can, maybe having an older set of hearing aids you can supply in your bag as a backup. So having those things in place are important. For people who use wheelchairs, we recommend a tire inflator. And for those who have developmental disabilities, having a communication board. That's one thing that we provide in our shelters, which provide pictures for communication. And also having those different supplies, so toiletries, and again, depending on your disability, what you would need specifically. Extra, flashlights. Also having a whistle. If you have difficulty communicating, it's one way that you can reach out. Obviously, it's not going to contact first responders, but if you're in a building collapse, it's one way you can contact those in the building to tell them that you're in that location. So that's for evacuating. For staying at home, which is called an emergency supply kit. Those would be more for sheltering in place emergencies. And really, sheltering in place, it's a fancy term for stay where you are. And that's going to be emergencies like a snowstorm, could be an active shooter where it's not safe to go outside, or even chemical threats. These are some emergencies where you may have to stay for some time. You cannot leave where you are. So we usually recommend a gallon of water per person per day. That does seem like a lot of water. One thing I usually tell people, if you can't obviously provide bottles of water, filling your bathtub is one easy trick that you can have for having all the water, either for taking a bath or for drinking water. Canned food and a manual can opener are also other key things to have. And also having first aid kit, having a flashlight, having blankets, and also towels to keep heat in if for some reason, say if you lose heat during an emergency. Those are important. And also having other supplies. If you have the possibility of having an extra wheelchair or extra light cane if you're blind, having those things on hand also so you can navigate in your apartment or building. So those are things that we do provide that we talk about. Again, one is for evacuating, that's the go bag, which is a small bag or a bag on wheels. And we recommend you check it at least twice a year. Certain things may go bad. If you are in an emergency, you always want to restock your bag after that happens so you are prepared for the next emergency, God forbid. So that's for evacuating, and for sheltering in place, again, it's the emergency supply kit. So having those supplies, again, for the general population are really important, but especially for people with disabilities. We have additional needs. Again, we're thinking about this in advance. If you do it actually during the emergency, it's going to be troublesome. You may forget information. You may not have certain items. It's going to make it way more difficult if you don't plan ahead. And finally, being informed, we have certain programs like Notify NYC, Know Your Zone, which I mentioned. That's for hurricane evacuation zones, knowing what zone you live in. For Notify NYC, which I'll talk about in a second, that's another program that we have that provides alerts to the public. And also we have a website too, which is called Plan Now NYC, which is nyc.gov/PlanNowNYC. That is for emergencies that we don't talk about as much, but it goes into information about tips for active shooter, for explosive devices, certain things such as that. Next slide, Eli. Okay, so this slide talks about public messaging. So like Eli mentioned before, the city does message to the public when there are emergencies. So for individuals, it's important to pay attention to this messaging. This New York City specifically, we have a program called Notify NYC. We encourage all New Yorkers to sign up for it. It's a free alert program, and those who are in the city can sign up for up to 5 zip codes. And we also have an app now on Android and also for Apple. So what this program does, it provides alerts in New York City specific to those zip codes. And the information could be small emergencies like the transit system is not running, to streets being closed, to larger emergencies that a heat wave is going to hit the city or possibly a hurricane. So it provides information but also tips before an emergency to keep those prepared. The messaging too for people with disabilities is accessible. So Notify NYC, we have messaging in American Sign Language. So when you sign up for this, when you receive a message, it will be in different languages and also in American Sign Language. So there'll be a link to that, and it would be a YouTube video that is general messaging for people who are deaf or who are hard of hearing. So we have that. We have over 100 videos in American Sign Language, and also we have provide voiceover for those who are blind and or low vision. So the messaging, is specific to all different types of emergencies, but it is general as far as that goes. We also have another program for organizations, which is called the Advanced Warning System. and that's information for organizations. So if you work for an organization that deals with people with disabilities, you'll be providing alerts to your clients. So in New York City Emergency Management, we usually have a conference call with certain organizations that are part of the AWS, and then we have those who sign up for AWS messaging. So it would be messaging that is sent to those individuals, but then they message it to their clients. So those who are running a dialysis center, maybe providing chemo treatment, those types of organizations, but also could be for services for children and many other access and functional needs. We talk a lot about disabilities, but there's also access and functional needs that can be included too. So that AWS provides messaging to all those different organizations. And also public messaging too, like Eli mentioned before, whenever we have a press conference, the mayor, we will have American Sign Language interpreters there. We have a vendor that provides that. And I also did mention before, for the shelters, there's also VRI. So when we open shelters, there will be an actual tablet that we provide interpreters via an internet connection. Those are other ways that provide assistive communications throughout the city. Yeah, thanks. Oh, good.
Thanks, Matt. This is Eli here. So I just wanted to add a couple points here. So Notify NYC is specific to individuals, while AWS, Advanced Warning System, we send out to community organizations that work with people with disabilities. So again, it's that multifaceted communication approach. And in fact, as Matt and I are sitting here, we're looking out and it's snowing out, and we actually got an AWS message this morning. We got it from emergency management, and so myself here at the mayor's office for people with disabilities, we took that message, we posted it on our webpage. We also tweeted out the messages as well. So just an example of how the AWS, even today, we've been working with. I also wanted to mention that many jurisdictions are now getting text to 911. New York City itself is expected to have text to 911 within about 6 months or so. Check out 911.gov to find out if your jurisdiction is going to get 911, if it currently has it, and what are the sort of time frames involved in that. There's also something called Next Generation 911, which is a little further in the future, particularly here in the city, but other jurisdictions are starting to roll that out, and that's looking at video and photos, incorporating that into a 911 system. So Next Generation 911 is in the future, it's in the works, and you can find out about that and text to 911 at 911.gov. All right, so we're going to move on to our next slide, which is community planning. And all of this community planning information you can find in a toolkit that's at nyc.gov/ready/community preparedness page. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk a little bit more about community emergency planning, and we're on slide 24.
So Eli mentioned briefly the toolkit that we have, and that is a booklet that we provide to organizations when we do presentations. Community preparedness, it's a toolkit. We also have information on our website. So the toolkit specifically goes through all hazards, so different hazards that may hit the city and how to prepare for them. As far as community preparedness, it's including the whole community. So when an actual emergency happens, it's organizations and groups in New York City thinking as a whole how to prepare for emergencies, how to include people with disabilities from the start. So if there's planning in advance, including people with disabilities, having those groups included and knowing what their needs are. And the only way to really find that out is to work with the community. So this is, again, community preparedness, where those in the community can be someone's neighborhood, can be even small as someone's block, tenant association. So all these groups working together in the community to know if an actual emergency hits a location, knowing the individuals that are in that location and knowing what their needs are. So again, we talked about individual preparedness, but this is more community-based, where neighborhoods could come together, and if they know a person down the block has certain needs, they will go out. If there is an actual emergency, maybe they'll go knock on doors to see if that individual is okay, specifically during an emergency. So And again, other organizations for community preparedness might include dialysis centers, might include schools that deal with children with disabilities, other organizations. And we also have what we have on our website too in relation to the toolkit. There is sections in the toolkit that talk about a checklist for accessibility. It talks about evacuation. So these are some things that are in the toolkit, but we've also added on our website one-pagers for information dealing with the whole community. So information about outreach to the community, which talks about our Ready New York program and the community preparedness program. We also have an accessibility checklist, which talks about how certain locations, how specifically they should be accessible, what to look out for specifically in regards to accessibility. There's also a one-pager about evacuation, which talks about what we've talked about today, how to evacuate your community as a whole, but also individually what you should look for. That we have, amenities in our shelters such as wheelchairs, walkers, canes, and crutches, and also refrigerators for medication if someone is using insulin or their psychotropic medications. So we provide that to community, the information, and also information about the homebound evacuation operation, that is an option, which we provide to the community. So that's some other information. And also we have a one-pager about life-sustaining equipment. In New York City, there are utility companies that there is a list that one can sign up for if they are a life-sustaining equipment customer, and that could be using sleep apnea equipment, could be using a respirator, other equipment that would be life-saving. So in New York City, there's Con Edison and also PSE&G. Those are two of the utility companies that we have. So they have lists that someone can sign up for in case of an emergency. And in addition to that, so those are some of the one-pagers that we have. One other one I forgot to mention was there is a one-pager for assistive communications. So that goes for communities and community-based organizations how to provide assistive communications for the public. In regards to that, we have information there, simple things such as magnifying glasses or having information on large print, to more complicated things that some groups, community-based organizations, may not be able to provide because it might be a little more expensive, but it goes also into providing screen reading and screen magnification software. Also talks about people who are deaf and hard of hearing, such as interpreters, CART, and also amplified telephones. So those are some of the things that are listed in those one-pagers. But again, this is community preparedness for the whole community, such as neighborhoods and other maybe block associations, blocks, tenant associations. That's the main difference. But again, individuals are going to be a part of the community itself. And also for people with disabilities, you want to include them in all plans throughout the city.
Great, thanks, Matt. So we're going to move on to slide 25, which is it covers community engagement. And we wanted to just point out that we have a yearly Emergency Planning for People with Access and Functional Needs Symposium, and our next symposium is December 11th at NYU. We really encourage all jurisdictions, all state and local entities to consider having symposiums or having other kinds of outreach initiatives. So I'm going to actually turn over to Matt just to talk a little bit about the symposiums that we've had in the past and what we're planning for this year as well. And also, Matt, if we could just mention a little bit about pets and service animals. I know we've had a couple of fairs on that. So Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you. This is slide 25.
So yeah, as Eli mentioned, the symposium will be December 11th at NYU in Manhattan. So in the past, we've had symposiums where we touched upon evacuation and also sheltering in place for people with disabilities. We talked about utility companies and life-sustaining equipment, so different types of plans. This symposium specifically, it brings people with disabilities together, it brings planners together, advocacy organizations. So all these groups are in one location to speak about how they should be planning for people with disabilities, what steps that should be taken to be planning as a whole and also individually. So for December 11th, we are going to have a symposium where we're going to have actors actually speak about the disability access and functional need videos, which Eli mentioned before. We launched 2 new Ready New York videos that speak specifically about disabilities. So the plan is to have some of the actors actually speak about the making of the videos, and that's nyc.gov/readyny. That's where you can find the videos. And we'll have that. We're also going to have 2 breakout sessions, so one being about residential emergency preparedness for buildings, one about transportation safety, and also one about community preparedness. So there'll be 2 workshops that people can sign up for, and then also before that, planning a session with the actors to talk about the Ready New York videos. So this is an event that we hold annually, and like Eli mentioned, we support all the jurisdictions, cities, and states, to think about having this symposium where you can bring everyone together to see if if you're on the right plan, what steps should be taken if you're not taking them in regards to people with disabilities and emergencies.
All right, thanks, Matt. So this is slide 26, and we call this one Caregivers in Action. And there's a number of different icons and cartoons on this. Really what we're trying to emphasize is to make sure that we plan for healthcare delivery systems as well, and that people with disabilities and the disability community loop in organizations that support people with disabilities, and particularly organizations that are centered around Medicare and Medicaid. So be sure to consider those in your planning processes as well. In fact, everyone should check out cms.gov, because recently, back in November 2017, they put in effect final rules on emergency preparedness requirements. So check that out. It's new rules that are required for Medicare and Medicaid service providers. I think is really interesting to check out. Also, I wanted to mention that we have an Access and Functional Needs Working Group. They meet quarterly. The Access and Functional Needs Working Group works with healthcare providers and service providers in the community, dialysis centers, etc. And it's really trying to get input from the disability community and making sure that, as Matt mentioned, that we're planning together. In addition to that, we also have a Disability Community Advisory Panel, which came out of the BCID litigation. And they're really a close group that examine all aspects of emergency planning and people with disabilities. They look at things like some of our emergency planning efforts with exercises. They look at accessible transportation. And we really ask for their feedback and their guidance. So there's a multi-platform way of reaching out to the community. We have different audiences that we try to support, individuals with disabilities, community leaders, etc. All right, moving on to slide 27. And I wanted to include this. This slide has 2 images. One is our emergency management team and community members along with CERT, and they're at our Disability Pride Parade. Every year, in celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have a Pride Parade here in New York City. This year we celebrated our 4th Pride Parade. We had roughly close to 8,000 people joining in our parade, and it's a great way to reach out to the community and celebrate disability rights. Check out your local jurisdiction if they have a Disability Pride Parade. It's a great way to get out the word and to celebrate. And emergency management always joined us in the parade gatherings. So I also wanted to mention something called the curb cut effect. And I think it's an interesting tool or way of explaining why inclusive emergency management is so important. So back during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, out in California, in Berkeley, a number of individuals who were wheelchair users started breaking down curb cuts or curbs and started making their own curb cuts. And over the years, curb cuts became integrated into society, and now it's hard to imagine any kind of city that doesn't have curb cuts. Now, of course, there's a lot of work to be done to keep them up to date, make sure that they're being fixed and properly maintained. However, it's really hard, again, to think about a city without them. But the reason why I want to explain it this way is it's really about positive externalities. because a curb cut isn't just for wheelchair users anymore. It can be used for people with strollers. It can be used for walkers. It could be used for even delivery for people. So there's lots of different benefits that come out of what happened back in the 60s when somebody broke down a curb and created a curb cut. Other examples of the curb cut effect that I could think of were seatbelts. Seatbelts were originally designed for children, but now everyone uses a seatbelt. It saves approximately 300,000 lives since 1975. Another example is bike lanes, for example. They've noticed that in New York City with the creation of bike lanes, there's been a reduction in serious injury from pedestrians and bikers. So there's lots of different examples of the curb cut effect, and it's really a force multiplier. It's a way of providing access to individuals that benefits everyone. Another example would be our accessible shelter program. After the BCID litigation, we were required to make our evacuation centers more accessible. In so doing so, many of our evacuation centers are located in Department of Education schools. Many schools are pretty old. I think on average they're built in the 60s. So many of them were built without the idea of accessibility even in mind. This was before the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in making our evacuation centers more accessible, it means that schools are now more accessible. And that means that every day when kids go to school, they're going to have more access to the school themselves and also the restrooms. I just want to throw out one example. Over the weekend, I was actually at a Department of Education school. I was admiring the ramp that was installed at the school. It was on a Saturday. It wasn't even for a Department of Education event. It was for a community event, and everyone was able to utilize the ramp. Everyone was able to get access to the school. It wasn't just for an emergency. Another example is website accessibility. We've been looking at ways of making city websites even more accessible, and that has lent itself to making our Hurricane Zone Finder more accessible for screen readers, people who have low vision. Also, our apps, our Notify NYC app is also more accessible for screen readers. So these are just some examples of the curb cut effect. All right, moving on to some resources, and I wanted to provide as many resources as really possible. This is slide 28, because there's a lot out there. The first one I just wanted to recommend was CDC. This is a really highly organized resource for public health concerns, for example, Zika. I also wanted to point out that the California's Governor's Office of Emergency Services, this is the second resource, has lots and lots of information. Vance Taylor, who heads up the Office of Accessibility, has an AFN library, which has lots and lots of really useful information. I would suggest people check that out. It also has some guidance on active shooter, which is a real challenge, I think, for inclusive emergency planning. The third one here is Homeland Security, Office of Civil Rights. They have lots of information here as well. It's very organized. They've been having listening sessions across the country, and it's a great place to find out about where you can and where and how you can file legal complaints. Number 4, Health and Human Services, HHS. Again, it's a place with lots of information. They have a lot of information, particularly on English proficiency, and how can we support people who have who English isn't their first language or have limited English proficiency. Also, they have information on Empower data. And this is data that's given to every public health official working in emergency management, hospitals, and first responders. And it's information about people who use electronically dependent medical equipment. So check that out. They have Empower data. It's not particularized to any individual. Instead, it's quantified at the county level or the zip code level. Number 5 is Smart Cities. I wanted to include this. This is a little bit unusual, I think, to include in an emergency management webinar, but it's really interesting, and the purpose of Smart Cities is to bridge the digital divide between technology and people with disabilities in smart cities. I really recommend people check it out. There's lots of interesting resources on there. Individuals and organizations, families and friends should really check out all the things that are going on in smart cities and seeing how you can be a part of that movement. ADA Pacific Webinars is really a great place to get information on emergency management preparedness for people with disabilities. Excellent archived webinars really covering all kinds of different facets of inclusive emergency management. It also has a really great resource list of different kinds of information out there if you're looking at inclusive emergency management. And finally on this page is American Red Cross. It's a really great resource, particularly for individual preparedness. There's lots of checklists that are included on there. Really recommend people check out American Red Cross as well. All right, slide 29. I wanted to continue talking about resources because there's a whole bunch. Obviously, you can check out our website, the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, at nyc.gov/MOPD. Also, emergency management as well, nyc.gov/New York City Emergency Management. And we cross-link a lot of our information between both of our pages. Of course, there's FEMA, and as mentioned, they have a functional needs supportive services, which is useful information on shelter planning. It was developed back in 2012, but it still has a lot of really useful information that I suggest everyone take a look at. FEMA also has a lot of disaster-centric recovery information that I think people should take a look at as well. ADA.gov, which is really one of the most useful places to find information about how to plan and prepare inclusively. On there, you'll find things like ADA Best Practices Toolkit for state and local government for emergency managers. You'll find an emergency shelter checklist on there as well, an emergency management checklist, and a guide to local government and other resources. So check out ada.gov. They actually, it's about last year, they created an own dedicated page to emergency management and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So a really great resource. Also, I wanted to point out Partners for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. And this is supported by Marcy Roth and Paul Timmons, who are really developed a great website that has lots of information about inclusive emergency management. And in particular, it covers some of the more recent disasters. They have an action report that I recommend everyone take a look at from 2017. It covers things like Maria in a very in-depth way. So I really recommend people check out Partners for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. All right, so I think that brings us to a conclusion. If anybody wants to reach out to us, you can reach out to me. We have our contact information there, and also Matt as well. And we'd really like to thank ADA National Network for all the support and letting us be a part of this webinar today. And I think we're ready for any kind of questions, if there are any.
Well, thanks, Eli and Matt. That was very interesting. Lots of good resources as well. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can, of course, continue to type those into the chat box. We do have one question that someone asked. They wanted to know if you have people register with the fire department so that they know where people with disabilities live.
That's a great question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so New York City itself doesn't have a voluntary registry, or what used to be called a special needs registry. Instead, what we have really is a sort of multifaceted approach to emergency planning. What we found is that given the population density and the complexity of our city, that a registry really wasn't something that could support the complexity of our city. As far as localized registries, there probably are some some local fire departments in the city that do know about where people are in their local community, but there is no citywide registry. The other thing to remember is that registries are difficult to manage. You have to keep them up to date. There's an issue of when to activate them. There's also concerns about people feeling like they don't have to plan and prepare as much if they're on a registry. So in jurisdictions out there that are smaller or they feel like it meets their needs, I think a registry may be helpful for them. But for here in the city, we don't have any special registry or voluntary registry. At the precinct level, at the smaller level, there may be some lists that people keep at the fire department, but there's no protocol in place citywide for that.
You guys talked a lot about New York City. I think that's really good. That's helpful to hear an example of what one city is doing. I'm curious if you have a sense of the differences between New York City and other cities around the country.
Matt, I can take a first. Okay. Yeah, I think one of the big differences is New York City has a lot of resources available. It's a big city and it's very top down. So I know when we've worked with our colleagues out in California, they have different counties and cities that are sort of multi-layered, and it does make a challenge for emergency managers and planners to plan inclusively. Here in New York City, we have the benefit that we have one mayor, we have five boroughs, but really all of New York City government reports to the mayor. You do get some complications with the subway system in MTA, which is a quasi-state city function. But I think one of the benefits here in the city is we do have that sort of top-down approach, and we are resource-rich. So I think those are some big differences. I think in rural communities, what I would recommend for emergency managers is really meet people with disabilities in your community. They're going to be the best ones positioned to know how to plan and prepare for emergencies. And so reach out to independent living centers, reach out to your local health department, find out who's in your community, and plan and prepare.
So you mentioned that one of the problems that other cities have is that it's not a top-down structure where they're just reporting to a single authority. I'm sure that must be very difficult, and it can get very messy. Do you have any advice for people who are working in government who are trying to provide effective emergency services, but have to deal with maybe some bureaucracy or extra steps that's difficult to get things done quickly?
Yeah, two things that come to mind. First one is engage leadership. Reach out to elected officials. Make sure it's a priority. Do your homework. Find out what are the issues in the community, and really try to engage leadership as much as you can in order to have that top-down approach. So that's what comes to mind right away, is really trying to engage leadership. The other thing is communication. Communication is really essential for emergency managers to reach across different city agencies. So I think really trying to establish connections with people before an incident, before a disaster, is really crucial. So I would say reach out to elected officials, do your homework, show them why it's important to plan and prepare for emergencies, and also communicate across different city agencies. Reach out to your state partners. Again, the most important things for emergency managers often is that communication aspect. So those are my two recommendations.
Mm-hmm. So how is New York City doing when it comes to emergencies? Like, what are some of the recent disasters you've had? And do you have any numbers on how disabled people are getting through it? Are people still dying out there? Are they getting injured? What's the situation?
So post-Sandy, there's been a whole lot of work being done in order to really plan and prepare for people with disabilities. New York City itself has about 1 million people with disabilities. And if you go to nyc.gov/emergency management and go to their settlement page, you can actually pull up the 7 MOUs that cover things like community planning through a community panel, post-emergency canvassing, transportation, sheltering, high-rise evacuation, emergency communications, and power. And these MOUs really have aimed the city, I think, in the right direction to help plan and prepare for people with disabilities. So knock on wood, we haven't had a major hurricane, but I think there's a lot of things that we put into place to really support people with disabilities in a disaster. And again, I want to emphasize also the personal preparedness aspect of it as well. And I think it's a big challenge to try to get the word out and get people to plan and prepare, particularly people who may be living day by day and don't have the income to necessarily think about planning and have that go bag. But I think of the analogy of smoking as an example. For many years, people knew smoking was bad. Through the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of public ad campaigns done to really try to encourage people to stop smoking. And eventually, the people who stopped smoking, the numbers started to go down. And I think that's one way to kind of think about emergency preparedness, is to continue to put out that information out to the community and to individuals to get them to slowly sort of socialize the ideas of planning and preparing, and that's what Matt and I do. We often go out to the community and talk about how to plan and prepare, and trying to really sort of get people to understand the importance of it.
So we have another question that someone submitted. They are wondering if you have any recommendations for inclusive emergency preparedness on college campuses.
Yeah, so I think at the collegiate level there's a lot of information out there. Nearly every college campus has an Office of Disability, and so I would recommend going to them and then trying to marry what they have in place with the local emergency manager or whatever the emergency management facilities people are. Oftentimes the facilities people who may be also on the responder side aren't necessarily talking with the Office of Disability. So making that connection, I think, is really useful. There's the benefits of a campus is it's often closed. It's a closed system in the sense that you know who the students are. If you have a dormitory, you know who people are in the dorms are. So that's a benefit going for you. So I would recommend really collaborating between the Office of Disability that's there and then the first responders and facility staff that are there as well. There's lots of different resources at the collegiate level to take a look at. If you go to some of the larger colleges, they have some pretty good emergency plans already in place. So I would take a look at that as well. So yeah, I would recommend looking at some of those at the collegiate level, looking at what some of the bigger colleges have in place in particular, and then striking up that conversation between the first responders and facility staff at the college and the Office of Disability.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Earlier in the presentation, I thought, maybe it was Matt, I thought I heard a distinction being made between disability and functional needs. Is there a difference there, and could you clarify that?
So on our website, we have section DAFN, so it's disabilities, access, or functional needs. So for disabilities, obviously people who have functional needs, they have limitations in, at least two areas. So, I mean, someone that's usually how we describe, people with disabilities, trying to describe that during presentations. Access and functional needs can be anything from English as a second language, people who need interpreters for certain situations, women who are pregnant, maybe they can't stand on a certain line, or if they're in a shelter, maybe they have to, we try to move them to the front if we can, if there was a need, or provide assistance to them if they're waiting on the line. So trying to think of other things besides, obviously their disabilities are important, but also the access and functional needs can be part of that too. Seniors can be part of that. Seniors may have access to functional needs, but then eventually they become disabled. So let's try to have, that's a couple ways we try to distinguish the differences, but they kind of go hand in hand also in certain situations.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Something else I'd like to ask you guys, I think one of the best ways that we learn about how to do things better is by learning from mistakes. And I like the fact that both of you are focusing on kind of the different sides of this issue. Eli, maybe more from the standpoint of the governmental agencies that are responding, and Matt, you from the perspective of individuals with disabilities. I'd like to ask both of you if you have in mind any mistakes that you've encountered in the past, maybe some that NYC has made, or maybe ones you've heard about that just made you stop and think, oh man, I wish we had thought about that before it came up. So maybe Matt, we could start with you. I mean, when it comes to individuals with disabilities trying to be as prepared as they can for these disasters, I mean, are there any mistakes that people have made in the past, like a concrete example that you are aware of that the people could learn from?
I mean, possibly maybe people that didn't evacuate on time. Obviously, people were told to evacuate, but because of their disability, maybe they couldn't. So maybe they should have thought of things beforehand, but just thought, I'll be okay. But that wasn't the case. So for someone who's in a wheelchair or someone who is bedbound, if they didn't think of things in advance, those are things like that they should have considered. How am I going to evacuate? Like, how will first responders help me specifically? So those are some things that we've come in contact with. People have service animals or guide dogs. Again, like, what can I do if my service animal is not able to go through an emergency? Like, what are my next steps? That might be a couple things too, where people may not have thought, I might need other contacts, other people to help if my service animal or guide dog is not able to work specifically during an emergency. So those are a couple examples, I guess.
And this is Eli here. So, at the organizational level, at a state and local government level, I think oftentimes, this has happened in the past, that emergency managers have applied a sort of a reasonable accommodation standard. So, for example, in the employment context, if I want to make an accommodation at my work, say I have difficulties sitting at my desk and I want to get a reasonable accommodation to the kind of chair I sit in, that would be something that I would proactively tell my employer and say, I would need this reasonable accommodation, here's the reasons why. And I think there has been an instance where emergency managers have said, well, we don't know what particular reasonable accommodation you may need, so we're going to ask you to tell us what accommodation is needed at the emergency management level. It's what they call like ad hoc planning. And what we found is that, one, the courts don't like that. They say that you have to think about proactively about what kinds of issues, concerns, and functional needs a person with disabilities may have in an emergency, and really act proactively. So ad hoc planning and sort of assuming that you're going to get reasonable accommodations requests at the time of disaster is not a way to plan inclusively. Instead, you should involve the disability community, ask them what are the functional needs they need in order to evacuate, get transportation and sheltering, etc. So that's one example. The other one that we do see is in the context of contracting or procurement, when you involve a second party and you think, oh, well, my obligations are no longer there under the Americans with Disabilities Act because we've contracted them away. And really, that's the wrong way to think about things, because if you're a state or local entity and you're involved in emergency management, you can contract away your legal obligations. So I would say that when you're considering these things, make sure that when you are working with a secondary party, that they understand that they're going to have obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act as well, and that you are equal partners.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We have a listener who submitted a question. They want to know how you handle emotional support animals versus service animals in emergency shelters. I think the question here might be twofold. First of all, how are your emergency shelters just handling service animals? And then also, I think the listener wants to know if you make a distinction between a service animal and an emotional support animal. Is there any different treatment there?
That's a great question. Matt, do you want to take this one?
So in our emergency shelters, we have a pet-friendly room for pets, and then for service animals, we don't separate the individual from their service animal. As far as the distinction goes for emotional support animals, during an emergency, we want to help all the general public, people if they come in and they say we have an emotional support animal, we're going to take their word for it. We want to help everyone during an emergency. Obviously, per the ADA, there's two questions that someone can ask. Is it a service animal? What are they trained for? But specifically for emotional support animals, for service animals, there really isn't a distinction because we want to ensure that everyone is safe during an emergency, that they're able to come to a shelter and stay there to be safe during an actual hurricane. I know for other jurisdictions and other places, other locations, there might just be that service animals are allowed and not pets. So there is some issues with that. But for New York City specifically, we allow pets and also service animals in the shelter at the same time.
Here's another question. You might have dealt with this earlier when you talked about registries, but this question is there an emergency list that I can register with in help of times of emergency?
So yeah, as mentioned, in New York City we don't have a voluntary registry or a special needs registry, and like I mentioned, there are lots of the city itself is so big and dense that it would be very difficult to keep a registry and keep it up to date. Also, there are questions about when do you activate the registry, and we don't want people to think that just because they're on a registry they don't have to go through the individual preparedness or the community preparedness as well. I would encourage people to take a look at ADA Pacific. They had a couple of really great presentations on registries and where they've worked and frankly where they haven't worked. And I'd also take a look at some of the recent after-action reports that have come out of Harvey and in particular about the usefulness of registries, which I think they've really called into question, again, for some of the reasons why we've mentioned. Instead, what we'd really encourage people to do is to plan and prepare individually and with your community. But with that said, there may be instances, and I think it's really up to the emergency managers and the community and the jurisdiction they're in to decide what registry, if a registry makes sense to them. So I think it's case by case. Here in New York City, though, we don't have a voluntary registry that's citywide.
Okay, maybe we'll just ask one more question here. How do you handle evacuation of people with disabilities who have bulky equipment, like maybe stuff it's very heavy, it's hard to move? Do you have any practices in place to make that effective?
So we have a program called the Homebound Evacuation Operation. In that instance, it's a program that we provide for evacuation. So in New York City, through 311, individuals with disabilities can call 311, and then from what they tell the call representatives, as far as what they need assistance with pertaining to their disability, there'll be questions that are asked. They're transportation assistance level questions. So pertaining, some questions would be, can you get to the curb? Can you sit up? Can you get out of your apartment? So questions specifically like that that the call representative will go through, and the forms of transportation that if someone has a disability, they will be routed to our paratransit Access-a-Ride if they can get to the curb. If they have additional medical needs, either the fire department or EMS will assist with evacuating individuals with disabilities. This is a last resort program that we have for transportation, but it's one way if someone has, like you mentioned, bulky equipment, it's one way that evacuation is possible.
Okay, great. Let's go on to slide 31. I want to thank Eli and Matt for presenting to us today. Do you guys have any final words for our audience?
Thanks for having us today. Feel free to reach out to us directly. Both Matt and I are happy to talk more about emergency management and planning inclusively for everyone. I think given what we've seen, and even just today and the devastating fires out in California, emergency management and planning for people with disabilities is so important, and it really has an effect to help all emergency managers plan more effectively across the country. So feel free to reach out to us, and thank you so much for having us today. I don't know, Matt, did you have any final thoughts? Nope, he said he's good. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's go to slide 32. And here you'll see the Certificate of Participation code. The code is PLAN. And for the people on the phone, I'll say that again. It is PLAN, P-L-A-N. Now, you will receive an email with instructions for how you can use this code to get that Certificate of Participation, so be on the lookout for that. You will also receive information through email about session evaluations, so we'd like to hear your thoughts on this session today. And we pay very close attention to what you guys think and the feedback that you give. We've actually been making some changes recently based on feedback you've given us, so we really appreciate it, and please keep it coming. Okay, on slide 33, we have our contact information. Again, we are the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. We are a grant-funded project of Transcend, Inc. You can call the ADA Center toll-free, 800-949-4232. If you call that number, you'll be directed to whichever ADA Center your area code is linked to. If you are in our region, you can call us directly at 301-217-0124, and we cover the Mid-Atlantic region, so that's Washington, D.C., Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. You can send us an email at adainfo@transcend.org, and you can also check out our website, adainfo.org. We have lots of resources for you and other upcoming webinars, so check back frequently to see what we have coming up. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day.